curved seam. Most of the garments like salwar kameez, shirt, blouse or top have curved segments like the necklines and armholes, which would require a curved seam. Thus, curved seam forms an essential part of garment making, and it is this curved seam that we are going to learn in this class. Objectives: at the end of this class, you will be able to identify a curved seam. Sew a curved seam. What is a curved seam? A curved seam is a type of a plain seam. There are two types of curved seam, one with the outward curve and the other with the inward curve. This is what they look like. Curved seams are part of every garment, so it is necessary to know how to prepare and sew a curved seam. Let's see how to do a curved seam on a sample. Procedure of sewing a curved seam. You will need the following items to do this sample: cotton fabric, straight ruler, pattern square, straight pins, measuring tape, tailor's chalk, shears, a pair of small scissors, contrasting thread, iron, sewing machine. Now let's begin. Step 1. Measure, mark, and cut out the sample fabric pieces. At the outset, take 2 layers of cotton fabric. Measure and draw 10 by 20 square on it with the help of a ruler, pattern square, measuring tape, and a tailor's chalk. Using the shears, cut the marked squares. Step 2. Draw a curved line in the center and cut along the line. Take those 2 pieces together and place them on the top of one another with their right side inside. Place the pattern square in the center and draw a curved line. You can use straight pins to keep the 2 fabric pieces together. Then cut both fabrics at once along with this marked line. Step 3. Mark the seam allowance. Now you have double sample with 2 pieces in each, one with an outward curve and one with an inward curve. Again, measure and mark a 1-inch seam allowance on the wrong side of the upper fabric piece of both the samples with the help of a pattern square, measuring tape, and tailor's chalk. Now we have 2 sets of cloth pieces pinned together with the marked seam line facing up. Now we will start stitching. Before we stitch, a tip to remember. Curved seams require careful attention in handling and shaping. To get well-shaped curves and to ensure extra strength, use shorter stitch length and sew in slow speed. First, we will start stitching the curved seam with the outward curve. Step 4. Stitch the curved seam with the outward curve. With the help of the stitch length regulator, change the stitch length from the normal stitch to the shorter stitch. Press the reverse stitch lever and start with the reverse stitch to prevent the seam from opening. Stitch along the seam line with a shorter stitch length of the outward curved seam sample. Again, press the reverse stitch lever and end with the reverse stitch to prevent the seam from opening. Snip the thread with a pair of small scissors and remove the straight pins. Step 5. Cut notches into seam allowance. Before opening the fabric, cut little notches with shears into the seam allowance, but be careful not to cut into the stitched seam. This will reduce the material bulk and the seam will lie flat when opened. This time, after opening, the two wrong sides will be facing each other. Step 6. Press the outward curved seam. Now press the curved seam with an iron. Finally, you have your sample with the outward curved seam ready. Please note, here we are using a contrasting thread for demonstration purposes only, so that it is visible, but otherwise one would use a thread matching to the fabric. Now we will start stitching the curved seam with the inward curve. Step 7. Stitch the curved seam with the inward curve. Please remember, the stitch length is short. Press the reverse stitch lever and start with the reverse stitch to prevent the seam from opening. Stitch along the seam line with a shorter stitch length of the inward curved seam sample. Again, press the reverse stitch lever and end with the reverse stitch to prevent the seam from opening. Snip the thread with a pair of small scissors and remove the straight pins. Step 8. Cut little clips into the seam allowance. Before opening the fabric, make little clips with the small scissors all along the seam allowance, but be careful not to cut into the stitched seam. This will help the curved seam to lie flat when opened. This time, after opening, the two wrong sides will be facing each other. Step 9. Press the inward curved seam. Now press the curved seam with an iron. Finally, you have your sample with the inward curved seam ready. With that, we come to the end of this class. Let's recall what we have learned in this class. curved seam is a type of plain seam and it is an essential part of every garment. They are of two types, outward curved seam and inward curved seam. The procedure of sewing the curved seam, let's review its basic steps. Step 1. Measure, mark, and cut out the sample fabric pieces. Step 2. Draw a curved line in the center and cut along the line. Step 3. Mark the seam allowance. Step 4. Stitch the curved seam with the outward curve. Step 5. Cut notches into the seam allowance. Step 6. Press the outward curved seam. Step 7. Stitch the curved seam with the inward curve. Step 8. Cut little clips into the seam allowance. Step 9. Press the inward curved seam. This is the curved seam. You have now learned all about the curved seam. Take our next class to learn about the corner seam.